I think maybe it's a story I tell. If I destroy myself enough, you'll care for me, right? I suppose this story, started at a young age. I mean, I was at a very young age when the idea first came into my head. It was the morning after Christmas, which of course carried at the time a kind of post-coital depression, one I was susceptible to because of my age and because I had not yet discovered that some things pass and end forever. I had taken to sitting flaccidly on the sofa next to my fleshy Aunt Ruth, with the intention of playing with a blue plastic boat I had received the day prior, and trying to figure out if it still made me as happy today as it had yesterday. And anyway, I was told after sitting down that it would be pleasant of me to hold Aunt Ruth's hand to comfort her, for she was afraid of the dog belonging to my other aunt, which we of course later learned that the dog was rabid, so she had every right to be afraid. At the time, however, my other aunt and her family, just thought that the dog was, broken. Abused in some kind of way, which I imagine that one leads to the other, but in this particular case, the dog was rabid with the absence of trauma. He was just born wrong, or infected, something of a random happening, a circumstance. Regardless, the dog's name was Kissinger, which I didn't understand at the time and still don't really. My other aunt was particularly anti-war, even after the fact, which contributed, I suppose, to his naming. Rather stupid, I thought, even at age 5. I sometimes wonder if the name made him rabid, meaning that the expectation of badness in him which was inferred by the name caused his disease somehow. I don't know why you would name something you cared for after somebody you hate. I still don't understand it. But I look at you and I think, maybe I do. And I held Aunt Ruth's hand on the pink sofa, and everybody thought it was perfectly nice, except for Aunt Ruth, who had begun to sweat through her mauve suit and smell of lilac and body odor. She knew that there was something terribly, irreparably wrong with this dog, and it frightened her to be in the same room with him, because, I don't know, I think she might have been afraid of a random act of violence, or that perhaps the secret knowledge she held would have led to her punishment via the instinct that we all have to look at something that dislikes us and try to annihilate it. It also becomes important here to note that my Aunt Ruth, the one afraid of the dog, was highly pro-war. She was a woman steeped deeply in the mythos of patriotism. A large, lumpy, and reeking, she sort of clasped on to something of the kitsch of Americana and began to strangle it for meaning. I tell you this because she looked at me shortly before the incident unfolded and said, "You don't know war because you've never fucked. Your Aunt Tippy doesn't know war because she's never fucked." I didn't know what that meant at the time, and I still don't really understand it. My experience of literature courses at college make me wonder if she meant that I had no sense of narrative, which would be an insightful thing to say, and would still be a rather insightful thing to say in regards to my life now, I think. But the fact of the matter is that Aunt Ruth was not a sophisticated woman. She was a woman who really only doled advice via narcissism, coded as pithy, guilt-inducing sayings. The guilt was that you didn't like these sayings as much as she clearly did. Things like "fuck before the bomb drops" and "don't sniff a left-winged penis" and vague suggestive colloquialisms like that. And anyway, it's awfully ironic, because the lesson she taught me that day was a lesson in self-interest, and she did it in such a way that promoted both her own self-interest and sparked my own curiosity in regards to where my self-interest might lie and exist. And of course this all naturally ties back to love, but I'm tired of straight lines. The point is, the whole fact of the matter is what happened next. I leaned over to eat 2 of the butterfly crackers on the coffee table, but I was cut off by Aunt Ruth, who without warning grabbed the cheese knife off of the platter and stuck it deep, deep into her thigh. Part of the decorative hilt disappeared in white flesh, which was now naturally cascading over with red blood, and she didn't scream, or howl, or throw any kind of fit. She just sat there, on the couch, bleeding profusely from a punctured artery. Something beautiful about it in retrospect, I suppose, but of course I didn't see it at the moment. My first thought was Aunt Tippy will be furious about the stain on the couch, and my second thought was I'm afraid. I mean, I actually thought to myself, I'm so afraid right now. Can you imagine that? Iceman as I now am. But back then I was a child and something of a softer, less sour person. Sweet, I'd go so far as to say, and I did what sweet, good children would do in that particular circumstance, which is I screamed out for my mother. I cried, "Mother," which seems a little too Sharon Tate looking back at it all, but it was the best use of language I had at the time, which I still feel bound in language when asking for help. Do you see that in me? Don't answer, I'm not looking for one. And bound up in the horror of it all and the added horror of a limited vocabulary to express the horror, I cried, "Mother," over and over and over again until somebody came running. The person in this instance was my father, followed by my mother, followed by everybody else in attendance at the party, and there was a general utterance of horror and then a great sudden stillness as people decided what to do. This stillness might have gone on forever, only Kissinger the dog, who even dogs can sense when something is gravely wrong. Did you know that? He barked 3 times. 3 short barks. Bark, bark, bark. And my aunt began to shake, and my cousin Peg, with the long dirty hair, cried out that it was the call of the raven after Peter denied Jesus. My Uncle Henry hit Cousin Peg after she said that, but nobody did anything to stop him. At this point we had all been a bit spent with mania. I'll never forget the look on Peg's face after that. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, and my aunt was bleeding out on a couch, and nobody really cared about either. But because of politeness, maybe because of decorum, we all reacted as reasonable, sweet, well-adjusted people would react. My mother called 911, and my father, who as far as I know had never touched another human being until this very moment, went and took Aunt Ruth's hand. My father had remarkably soft hands. Feminine is what my Uncle Henry would call them, because he, my father, worked as a shoe shine and the polish had penetrated the... For weeks after this I would ask my father to hold my hand when we went places, just to see if I might be able to feel that sense of tenderness that Aunt Ruth must have felt when he took her hand on the couch. And he never would. I never quite figured out then why he wouldn't, but I certainly know now. And anyway, my father was holding her big, smelly hand in his small, soft one, and my Aunt Tippy, the anti-war aunt, ran over and tried to create a tourniquet with an old bedsheet she had run and grabbed. The situation wasn't dire enough to use a nice bedsheet, at least she thought so. And she bent over Aunt Ruth, but Aunt Ruth swatted her hand away and said, "No, I don't want that. No, I don't want that." Do you remember me saying that to you? Do you remember that? There was a time when you would love me regardless of anything I said or did with or without. And nobody knew what to do, because she was bleeding her guts out onto the sofa. The puncture had struck such a spot that after a while the whole affair began to actively gush, meaning that there was some height to the thing, and she would die without interference. Even I knew that. But she didn't want any help. My Uncle Henry said, "Leave the bitch then." And my mother said, "Francis, do something." And my father cried. And my Aunt Tippy grabbed a hold of Aunt Ruth and pulled her onto the rug and said the sofa was expensive. And my cousin Peg said I didn't do anything wrong. And as a group, it seemed to be decided that the best thing to do was to wait there with Aunt Ruth until she decided that she wanted help. So we all held hands and watched her, and watched her, and watched her. And my father held her hand, and Peg started singing Kumbaya. And she died, of course. Emptied herself right out onto the sofa and died. And I think she did it for a bit of attention, or love, or maybe to teach me a lesson or something. It all felt terribly extreme at the time, but I look back and I realized that maybe it wasn't, and maybe my Aunt Ruth was, whether she knew it or not, the smartest woman I've ever known. And it's taught me something about love, which is that our love is afforded because of people who are unhappy, and because we have the freedom and the right to make ourselves, to mutilate ourselves into an unhappiness which reflects the unhappiness of these truly unhappy people. Because people go around and ask for love in all sorts, in all constellations of ways. And the fact is that we're allowed to do these things, these covered things which imply a screaming of, perhaps I am not being truthful about something, because we have allowed the other people, the people who are in third world countries or at war, or told that there are bombs inside of them, to experience the fullest, richest experience of pain, which is also, in a way, the fullest, richest form of attention. And so we become imitators or pseudo-martyrs who dress ourselves as experiencing something which does not entirely belong to us. And this imitation fools outside brains enough to convince other people to think, oh, perhaps I should love this person right now. Or perhaps it will make me feel better about third world countries and war and people with bombs in them if I show sympathy and kindness to this imitator. And it's a matter of reciprocity in that way. And so I mutilate myself because you have a sense of morality. You have a sense of morality which is not your own, but which is inside you now like a disease, and which compels you, which forces you to love me when I do terrible, terrible things. And I learned this trick from watching Aunt Ruth, because nobody had ever held her hand before that day. You are infused at a young age with a metal claw of morality which pulls you to love that which you find distasteful. And in your own way, you restart the cycle of martyrdom, of mutilation, of forcing someone else to love you. And of course, you could argue that there are people who will tear themselves up inside and test the violence of Stoicism, but I think that's a stupid thing, because Stoics are always tasteless and hard and not at all easy to feel sorry for, unless you are, of course, a particularly soft-hearted person. But these soft-hearted people are often too busy bleeding for the loudest mouth or the moral mouth, and because of this, being a Stoic won't do it all. No. I learned from an early age that in order to be a true and effective imitator, a person has to make their pain apparent and obvious, because of the nature of it all. Lack of nuance makes it easier to get your love, which is money, which is currency in the world I feel I live in. You understand why I feel this? You understand why your love might be my money, my candy? I think it is in part because of my own iron claw of morality, and the idea that maybe, if I mutilate myself enough and you love me enough, I will somehow become a good person. Because I once told myself, and I rarely communicate with myself, I told myself that I could maybe love myself at the end of the world, of my world. And now I think the truth is that maybe I was just being a little extreme. And maybe the gentler, more simple truth is that I can never love myself, or can never have any other love for myself than an artificial love, a love which makes me blow kisses at strangers, a love which is brought on by this violent act of imitation, you understand? And because of all of this, because of the limitations of my love and because of what I learned from Aunt Ruth that day, I have decided that I am in favor of the war, that I think the war is a good thing, and that I hope it goes on and on and on and never ends, and all that. Because without war, there is no pure suffering, and therefore no sense of non-actualized guilt and lack of fulfillment from the people who are allowed to simply sit and hear about awful things. And without this, there is no love. And so because I live in a place where we are allowed the privilege of sitting still and sipping coffee out of china cups and merely hearing about awful things, I hope as many unpleasant things happen as possible, because it tenderizes you and prepares you to love me, out of guilt and out of morality. And when you see me mutilate myself, you love me more, and this is because of the war, and so I hope it never, never goes away. Because I will not stop tearing myself up until you are gripped by the iron claw and you love me completely. Will you hold me? What happened to the dog? To Kissinger? Oh. He was put down the next day. They blamed him for the death of my aunt. Which I know it sounds perfectly silly, but self-mutilation was practically unheard of at the time and absolutely extinct in my family, and my Aunt Tippy was of the mindset that anything evil must be immediately destroyed or erased. It's one of the reasons, I think, that she was so very lonely. There was no contrast in her life. It was all feather-soft and dewy, and so there was no love. So anyway, the choice was between blaming and killing me or blaming and killing Kissinger, as we were the only two in the room at the time of the incident, and we all knew that Aunt Ruth had been afraid of Kissinger. Then my mother had grown rather fond of me, so we killed the dog. They made Cousin Peg do it, because she had the strongest sense of morality. She was never quite the same afterwards, I think. Continued the trend of members of my family taking this theory of love too far and bringing themselves to the point of annihilation. I lost something to Cousin Peg, too, I think, although I can't remember what it was. But the dog died. Kissinger died. My aunt got a new dog and named him Vietnam. At this particular point, however, the gag of the dog names had worn off, and my whole family was just a little taken aback by the whole thing. She would dress Vietnam up in baby clothes and wheel him around, which I only think enforces my point that it is impossible to fabricate love out of plain goodness, although God knows Aunt Tippy tried and tried. She ended up being intimate with Vietnam at some point. I know this because she got a sexually transmitted... She became infected in some way, and it ended up mutilating her, which, well, then everyone was nice to her and she was happy. And I think she was happy that she had gotten a sexually transmitted disease from a dog named after a war she hated. And so, like every member of my family, Aunt Tippy learned that the war is a good thing, because it made her feel loved, because war has the unique ability to make people who are already comfortable feel more comfortable, because it informs the public enough to recognize when the rich, when the privileged people like me, put on the burlesque of war victims. And it forces secondhand sympathy and causes these people to love us, the imitators. Which means that war is love to the people who sit and sip coffee and chat about things that are beautiful. Which means I think that war is love. Period. Do you understand?